Hi everybody, and I'd just like to welcome everyone this evening to this webinar, kindly organised by Salisbury CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. This evening we have three speakers. We have Andy and Phil who are going to present some of their work from SPRU and Roland Dye. So I'll just give you a bit from Andy and Phil's biographies. Andy Stirling is the Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. He works on issues of power, uncertainty and diversity in science and technology. He has served on a number of UK and EU governmental advisory committees. And Phil Johnstone is a research fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex. Phil's research is broadly focused on the political and democratic implications of energy transitions and the role of military in innovation and technological development. He has a long-standing interest in nuclear power. And Roland Dye is a nuclear physicist, spent all of his working life working in the industry, and had an epiphany, as I understand it, and when he realised that he was on the wrong side, and since he retired, he's been putting that to rights with great zeal and doing an awful lot of good anti-nuclear and climate campaigning. So welcome everybody. And I've just returned myself to the screen. So just to say that I live in a very rural area, and so my broadband connection isn't fantastic. As the webinar progresses this evening, if you see me disappear, it's just me turning my video off to make sure that I maintain my audio because I'm having signal problems. So just to let you know if that happens. And take it that we'll start with Andy first. So Andy, work away.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just go to the inevitable slides. There we are. Everybody should be seeing a slide saying the real reason why the government is pursuing new nuclear power. And thank you so much to everybody involved in giving Phil and I this invitation to talk about our work on these issues. And I have to say, as somebody who's worked all my working life really variously in and around UK energy policy, I've really been taken aback by what Phil and I have come across over the last few years and what the implications are for energy policy, for climate policy, and for British democracy taken together. So it's a real, sort of privilege to be able to share that with this group, and I look forward to the questions. I'll speak for 15 minutes, then Phil will pick up afterwards. We'll begin with some of the background, and then Phil will drill down into some of the details. So the starting point really is to just ask the very simple question: why is the UK government so intensely committed to civil nuclear power? Because as years unfold, it's getting progressively more and more difficult to understand why that might be. Whatever side of the debate one is on, it really is difficult, and especially in relation to the main argument being deployed, not only by government, but also by many who are apologists for the policy in policy circles, that it's to do with climate change. So let me just run through some of the key reasons why I'm making that rather strong criticism of UK government policy. So if the reason, as stated repeatedly, is primarily about reducing climate change, then the first point is that existing nuclear power as we have it now is really manifestly slow at reducing climate change. And one doesn't have to look very far. You certainly don't have to look beyond the position the government takes itself. Nothing that Phil and I will say in this talk goes beyond facts and evidence and arguments that are used routinely in policy debates. So it's easy for anyone to see, for instance, that the one construction project underway, the Hinkley Point C project, is running now 10 years late. It was supposed to be originally in Christmas 2017. Christmas 2017, that the UK would be roasting its Christmas turkeys on Hinkley electricity. That was the claim made at the beginning. Otherwise, it was stated very emphatically, the lights would go out. Well, we can see those kinds of statements now in a new light. Other projects of the same, basically the same kind of nuclear power station in France and Finland are even more plagued by delays. So it's really far from clear now, even approaching halfway through the project, that we aren't in for more serious delays than we've already experienced. And other proposed UK nuclear power construction projects around the country for existing designs are as yet unstarted entirely. And in fact, really looking increasingly likely they will never get started. Now, if we then turn to the much touted new generations of reactors, small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, SMRs and AMRs, these are completely unpiloted, untested, undeveloped in the forms that are being promised. So they need entire development programs, then piloting programs, before then construction programs follow. And the record of delay, and again, this is not a partisan point, of the nuclear industry for entire new programs is even longer. The delays are even longer than for individual constructions. And this is important because the UK target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 68% over 1990 levels by 2030, only 9 years away. And actually, by law, to its credit, the government has undertaken that the UK should reach net zero by 2050. So there really is no ambiguity that there simply is no time for an entire new nuclear program. And even UK government data shows that there's really no credible chance of any significant new nuclear wider program to back that up. And at the same time, over the past 10 years, it's again not a contestable point that the UK has installed 10 gigawatts of offshore wind alone. That doesn't count solar, it doesn't count other renewables. And it's equivalent to 10, even accounting for the intermittency of wind, it's equivalent to 10 of the larger of the types of plants that are supposedly promised in the modular reactor program. So, and there's clearly proven capacity and experience within the UK and European renewable industries to rapidly accelerate that. That massive growth of 10 gigawatts is the beginning of a program which typically can ramp up. So basically, nuclear power cannot achieve these goals, these stated goals. Renewables can. Then when we look at costs, how much will it cost to achieve these climate change abatement goals? It's again, the picture is even further compounded, because at current prices, the 35-year contracts which were forced on consumers, that's the wording of the National Audit Office, for the electricity from Hinkley Point C when it comes online, are more than £102 a megawatt hour in current prices. The current contract prices at the moment, coming down rapidly year on year, but at the moment still going down, are already at £40. So the cost of wind is not just a small debatable difference, it's a massive difference in these contract prices between 40 and 102. And energy efficiency and demand management investment do now and have always proven to save emissions far more cost effectively even than any renewable. And the same picture applies. We often hear arguments about intermittency, interseasonality, and these undoubted challenges of adapting the system. The government itself, so one doesn't need to go beyond the government data, the government itself repeatedly emphasizes in background figures that intermittency, interseasonality don't actually increase the cost significantly to change the picture that I've just presented. So here are government data from BEIS, the Ministry of Energy and Industry, last year. Onshore wind, 56 to 73, large scale solar, 53 to 66 pounds a megawatt hour, offshore wind 69.25. Those numbers, according to the government, include the costs of intermittency. So it's not a separate issue that comes in as so often the case in these arguments, it's included. And actually it's remarkable now, with the argument essentially over on these issues that still vex the media and wider debate, that we, for the first time ever, saw a government white paper that published no cost figures in December 2020. It's really remarkable, the situation we're in with this kind of cost picture. And of course, speculative future nuclear programs have always involved escalating, not falling costs. So there's really very little basis in experience in history to believe that oncoming nuclear plants, which have always been more expensive, will actually turn out to be less so. So basically, the picture is that nuclear spending is not only is nuclear slow, but spending on nuclear takes money away from investments that would otherwise be possible for renewables to achieve these faster climate change goals. So the trends, maybe there's hope in the trends, the way things are going. Well, I'm afraid the picture I've just painted is further intensified by the patterns over time, because the gap, the efficacy gap of nuclear for delivering electricity and mitigating climate change is growing, not diminishing. Here's data from Lazard, one of the best respected international sources of information on levelized costs. It's another way of looking at costs. But you can look at, the slides are available, you can look at it more closely afterwards if you like. But the point here is it simply shows that solar and wind have gone down massively over the last 10 years. In fact, solar's gone down by nearly 900% in its cost. Wind has gone down by 70%, and nuclear around the world, the costs, according to Lazard, so it's not partisan information, this is information that the markets are basing decisions on, has gone up. Nuclear costs have gone up over that period by 26%. So the idea that somehow the passage of time will improve the situation really is not credible against that background. And of course, there are other arguments. One of the most important one is about base load or firm nuclear power. But this idea that this property is a very odd thing that the British are especially caught up on, that somehow the inflexibility of nuclear power, that it can't go up or down in its output, is an advantage, is a really eccentric idea. And it's acknowledged by industry. Steve Holliday, the CEO of National Grid Company in 2015, called it an outdated idea even then. And it's become more so as technologies have advanced for smart grids. Official data again, so not going beyond government data, show that the government renewable resource is far larger than foreseeable demand. So government data shows we can in fact deliver not only the electricity needs of the country, but the transport needs by electricity from the available viable renewable resource. That's long been the case. I've studied this since the 80s, and it clashes with what ministers say and sometimes chief scientists. But I'm afraid we're routinely provided with information by senior figures that clashes with the government's own data that they publish in background documents. And for intermittency, we have smart grids where actually, and increasingly being invested in all kinds of demand management techniques we can talk about in the question session if people are interested, whereby this inflexible nuclear output actually becomes more of a disadvantage than an advantage. And the idea that small modular reactors can be more flexible is actually, again, a speculative idea. They are operated that way in the military, but ramping and cycling, turning up and down nuclear plants actually does hold safety implications, and we've yet to see what the regulatory repercussions of using nuclear in that way has been. There's been questions in France on that point. So in short, renewables are a domestic power supply, source of power. They're safer, they're more diverse, and they're more secure than nuclear power is. I don't think those are very controversial statements to make. And renewables and energy efficiency investments are far more productive of UK jobs. So the picture really is stark. It's really odd, even just looking at government's own data, why it should be that the UK government is so committed to nuclear power. So the starting point then for turning over to Phil is to say, which Phil and I were asking about a few years ago, why is it that the UK is so committed to nuclear power? And when you look in the right places, the answer is absolutely obvious and clear. It's the military need, the perceived need for nuclear. And it's not so much weapons. We can go into the details. It's nuclear propulsion for submarines. They're very difficult artifacts to build, and you need a massive nuclear industry. All the engineering companies that are involved in building nuclear power stations and nuclear reactors also are involved in building the nuclear propulsion systems for submarines. So what's remarkable is if you look at the defence documents in the UK, you see again and again, and Phil will go into this in a little bit more detail, that the military are very clear. They need the UK to have civil nuclear power at any cost in order to be able to build nuclear propelled submarines. But in the energy policy literature, it's entirely silent. There is nowhere, anywhere in British energy policy where this is acknowledged. In other countries, the US and France, Phil will go into this, it's more acknowledged, it's more openly admitted, it's begun to be just in the last couple of years. But in the UK, it still remains the case that the government sticks to this position, that this untenable argument that nuclear is there for climate change, when in fact it's slowing down our progress, is still made. And so the upshot of all this, because nuclear is so much more expensive than the alternative zero carbon options, is that UK consumers and taxpayers are paying tens of billions of pounds, hundreds of billions over the decades of these contracts, in order to subsidize an industry that is only needed for military purposes. And these contracts fall regressively. It's notorious how energy bills are regressive. Poorer households pay disproportionately more for them. And of course, this is without looking at the massive costs of research, development, decommissioning, waste management, security provision, a dedicated armed police force, for instance, anti-proliferation measures to stop diversions of fissile materials. These add massive costs to the ones that we've already been talking about. And these costs fall on all the UK nations, including notably Scotland, where there is very strong opposition to nuclear power, which may become more significant. So investing in nuclear rather than renewables and efficiency is clearly impeding progress on climate change. And providing affordable energy and achieving climate targets are actually a legal duty on government. So it's not going too far to say that the official position of prioritizing nuclear power is not just unjustified by evidence, it's actually arguably unlawful. So nuclear, then, the position that we have to explain why the government has got into this situation is that pursuit of nuclear power in the way it's happening is slow, it's costly, it's dishonest because the reasons aren't being given, it's therefore undemocratic, and it's unlawful. And Phil will now pick up on some of the specific evidence behind these military links. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Andy. Just give me a moment to share my screen, folks. And so I hope you can all see that okay. So just picking up from where Andy left off, in terms of these civil military links, one of the first places to look is at the broader international picture. And I can't go into the details of this diagram, but this is a correlation between nuclear ambition and different types of geopolitical status. And the broad things that we can take from this are the following. It is apparent that it's leading global military powers that are the most committed to large-scale nuclear new build. It's the case that there's no global or regional military power that does not hold an active history of very strong pressures for civil nuclear power. And indeed, no country either with or planning nuclear weapons or submarines is currently pursuing either a nuclear moratorium or a phase out. So in terms of this broad correlation, there really does seem to be a relationship, and it becomes more apparent when we look into the specifics. And as Andy was saying, internationally, in the last couple of years, really, the picture has become irrefutable. I mean, especially even in the last few months. And here we have the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, discussing civil military nuclear. And he said the following, this was in December 2020, to oppose civilian nuclear and military nuclear in terms of production and research does not make sense for a country like ours. Without civilian nuclear, no military nuclear. Without military nuclear, no civilian nuclear. So it doesn't get clearer than that. And then in the United States, a flurry of reports from 2017 onwards have been quite open about the interdependencies between civil and military nuclear. The influential Atlantic Council, a prominent security think tank, says the following, that the United States has a large educational R&D and industrial support system that underpins its civilian nuclear power sector as well as its military nuclear enterprise. Closure of nuclear reactors erodes this system and impacts both current and future military operations. And it's more specific, and this report actually goes into the details of what is essentially the subsidy that civil nuclear provides to the military nuclear complex. It says that the civilian nuclear energy enterprise contributes at least $42 billion annually to the pursuit of US national security priorities. In other words, an economic shock of at least that size would result immediately in the case of a rapid erosion of civilian nuclear capacity. So again, it doesn't get clearer than that costs of the military program are being underwritten by the civilian program. And this is especially the case with naval nuclear. A report by the Energy Innovation Reform Project says that a sustained decline in the commercial industry could also have a negative impact on the US nuclear naval program. The Center for Strategic and International Studies says that the naval nuclear capability is tied to the fate of the commercial nuclear sector. And Ernest Moniz, who's a former energy secretary, says that a strong domestic supply chain is needed to provide for nuclear navy requirements. This supply chain has an inherent and very strong overlap with the commercial nuclear energy. So it really is quite clear, and there's other quotes from other countries that we could also go into, but the case of France and the US, it really is clear, these links. So how about the UK? Well, it's a bit more hidden, but if you get into the details of military documentation and other related documentation, then you can see that the links are there. The Royal Academy of Engineering in 2009 highlighted that skills required in the design, build, operation, and disposal of naval nuclear reactors are in short supply and increasingly expensive. Decline of the civil nuclear program has forced the nuclear submarine program to develop and fund its own expertise. So again, the implication is that the civil nuclear program was covering some of the costs of the submarine program. Skill synergies pointed out by Rolls-Royce. Skills are considered to be transferable between military propulsion and civil programs. A larger involvement in the broader industry will also have a spillover benefit to military capability through skills development and experience exchange. The Dalton Institute, the UK is not now in the position of having financial or personnel resources to develop both programs in isolation. And the links between the civil and naval sector need to be encouraged. And Rolls-Royce in 2017, in a document on small modular reactors, which interestingly has now seemingly disappeared from their website, says that a key advantage of the small modular reactor program for ostensibly civil power reasons is that it will relieve the Ministry of Defence of the burden of developing and retaining skills and capability on the military side. So that's quite clear that that burden relates to costs. So it relieves some of those. So if you know where to look in the UK, these links are again crystal clear. And official UK defence sources confirm these important links. And a secret report written for the submarine industry in 2014 that was only obtained thanks to a Freedom of Information request by journalist Rob Edwards highlights that across the submarine enterprise, the availability of deep specialist expertise in key and suitably qualified staff appears to be at a bare minimum necessary to deliver the submarine program. And part of this crisis, it highlights, is that the MOD's program had been underwritten by civil nuclear research that has been dismantled and commercialized over the years, which has led to expertise in these activities being atrophied. So the report recommends that the program seeks imaginative methods to better engage with the emergent civil nuclear new build program on nuclear matters to the benefit of defence. The research group established a work strand to look at leveraging to maximum effect civil nuclear investment, and the MOD revisit the possible option of utilising other nuclear facilities, including in the civil sector. And this was taken up by government in the nuclear sector deal, which committed to increasing the opportunities for transferability between civil and defence industries and increasing mobility between the two. So clear commitments there try and strengthen these links. Yet UK energy debates tend to display an odd contrasting silence. There are exceptions. A report in 2013 by Oxford Energy highlight that naval and civil reactor industries, whilst often being viewed as separate, in actual fact, the timeline of the UK nuclear industry shows there's clear interactions between the two, particularly from a supply chain perspective. But the Dalton Nuclear Institute has highlighted that this link needs to be carefully managed to avoid the perception that civil and military nuclear programs are one and the same. And part of the problem and the challenge that the submarine industry faces was highlighted by BAE Systems, an executive of BAE, in a report in 2007, saying that nuclear submarines struggle to absorb their through-life costs through masking in other programs. So the clear ambition here, in the context of the other information, is to mask in other programs. And that program is civil nuclear energy. And in response to evidence we submitted to a government inquiry, for the first time on record, it was admitted by a lead civil servant, the permanent secretary of the MOD, Stephen Lovegrove, that we are completing the build of the nuclear submarines. There is an opportunity for the nation to grasp in building up our nuclear skills. I do not think that this is going to happen by accident. It's going to require concerted government action to make it happen. So there's something deliberate going on here. And Richard Harrington, former Undersecretary of State for Energy, stated that he wants to include the MOD more in everything we do. And he was at BEIS at the time, so Department of Energy and Business. And it's time that the artificial distinction between civil and military nuclear came to an end. So again, quite clear. And indeed, in recent years, after quite a few years of trying, this issue has been covered in the BBC, in the Daily Telegraph even. And as Andy mentioned, politically, it's really in Scotland that it's been picked up. There was a parliamentary motion in the Scottish Parliament highlighting these links. Yet silence continues from the UK government. And this is a problem with British democracy. As Andy mentioned, the 2020 Energy White Paper came out. The intense enthusiasm for nuclear continues despite renewables being manifestly cheaper. And indeed, it was odd that costings of these respective technologies were left out of the white paper itself. And the NEO has highlighted that there are indeed strategic factors beyond energy policy that explain the otherwise inexplicable UK nuclear policy. And it's clear that the military rationale is the most likely contender, yet the government does not officially acknowledge this, unlike in other countries like we've seen with Macron. But just at the same time as the 2020 paper, or around the same time that the 2020 white paper came out, buried away in the Nuclear Intelligence Weekly was a candid interview with Rolls-Royce, where it was stated that developing a UK small modular reactor program would help Rolls-Royce maintain UK capabilities for the military nuclear naval program. And it was stated by an employee of Rolls-Royce that it's absolutely complementary to have a thriving domestic civil nuclear program alongside a submarine program. We create a stronger skills base, a stronger supply chain, and feed a stronger industry. So while the government doesn't acknowledge it, buried away in these elsewhere is acknowledgement of this. So this is a problem of democracy. And the problem of democracy, I think, extends further into the incredible intensity of lobbying activities and favorable media coverage for nuclear advocacy that we've seen at the time when the case for nuclear is at its weakest. Strange things are going on in the Green Party. A Greens for Nuclear account was set up in 2019 on Twitter with the sole purpose of intensely promoting nuclear. Failed Green Party leadership candidate Rosie Sexton, who seemed to be closely aligned with this Greens for Nuclear account, was consistently urging the Greens to reconsider their opposition to new nuclear. And I know from personal experience, essentially refused to listen to any evidence critical of nuclear. Then, of course, we have Zion Lights. In 2020, Lights was employed in the UK branch of nuclear lobbyist Michael Schellenberger's Environmental Progress Group. Using the PR trope of the repentant critic, she claimed repeatedly without any evidence she had changed her mind on nuclear. And this garnered incredible media attention in City AM, repeatedly in the Daily Mail, The Sun, the BBC News, the Daily Telegraph, Prospect Union. Former BBC Today programme stalwart John Humphreys wrote a full-page spread in the Daily Mail advocating for new nuclear and giving favourable attention to Zion Light's supposed change of mind. UK pro-nuclear power group set up in 2020, Mothers for Nuclear Energy set up in 2020, Liberal Democrats for Nuclear Power 2020, Friends of Nuclear Energy that has been dormant for some time launched their Twitter campaign the same year. Isn't it amazing that these activities are intensifying to such a degree at the time when the case for nuclear is so weak? Demonstrations by activists like Nuclear for Net Zero at Sizewell. And this mirrors developments in the USA with the reframing of nuclear as progressive, with groups like the Good Energy Collective making the so-called progressive case for nuclear, but in fact run by former members of the Breakthrough Institute. Something very strange is going on in the UK at the moment with regards to nuclear, and it is a serious problem with regards to democracy. And to finish, I'm not going to go through this slide, but I'm just going to leave it there and remind you of what we said previously, that what is the issue? Well, the issue is that UK nuclear policy is deeply problematic. It's slow, costly, dishonest, undemocratic, and unlawful for the 12 points we have there. And with that, looking forward to questions and discussion, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hi there. So Roland, are you ready?
Yep, I'm here.
Go for it.
Hi, well, thanks very much for having me on here. I'm Dr. Roland Dye. I've got a first-class honours degree in physics, an MSc in radiation biology, and a PhD in nuclear medicine imaging. That doesn't mean that I'm smart, by the way, as you'll hear. But I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about propaganda. My story is how I went from someone who believed in nuclear power to someone who now actively campaigns against it. I was born in 1952, an interesting year. The Queen came to the throne, Britain exploded its first nuclear bomb, and was plotting a coup against the democratically elected government of Iran. I wasn't out of nappies when the government gave the go-ahead for Calder Hall, the first so-called civil nuclear power station in the world. They said it would produce electricity too cheap to meter. Ha! But as the Queen cut the ribbon, no one mentioned its real purpose was making plutonium. And by the 1960s, Britain had enough plutonium for over 100 nuclear bombs. And they flew them around the British Empire like a bully waving a big stick. And Britain must have decided it needed more physicists. So teachers, like at my school, encouraged us to do it at university. I remember how they taught us how one nuclear bomb could wipe out an entire city, how the radiation affects people's bodies, how they die, how long it takes. No one put their hand up to question the morality. I didn't. I was probably a right nerdy swat. But in 1983, I had my epiphany moment. I was sat on my sofa at home after a hard day's work in the nuclear medicine department, where I was working at a local hospital in the Midlands, and I was watching the television news. Greenpeace, don't you just love them, were putting their inflatables in the way of ships dumping barrels of radioactive waste into the sea. And the TV told me that that waste was coming from nuclear medicine departments, just like mine. And I knew that wasn't true. I wrote to complain. I've got the letters here still. They actually said needles, gloves, laboratory coats, glass dishes, and so on. I also wrote to Greenpeace to say, well done. Their offices got raided by MI5. And I ended up being interviewed on Newsnight with Duncan Campbell. What a privilege. But phew. There have been other epiphany moments. The undisclosed discharges from the Sellafield pipeline. The Windscale fire in 1957. What was it that caught fire? Testing the flasks, as they're called, used on the nuclear waste trains. The nuclear warhead convoys going up and down the country every other month. One came through the middle of Bristol, where I live, last autumn. Why? And in my day, don't get me started about novel nuclear power sources. In my day, it was fast breeder reactors. And now it's costing us an eye-watering amount to clean up the mess left at Dounreay. And the list goes on. I now know that those barrels being dumped off those ships were coming from Britain's nuclear bomb factory. And now they can't dump them into the sea. They've been piling them up somewhere on site for almost 4 decades. And that's just one reason that they're in special measures on health and safety. I happen to be familiar with Aldermaston and Burfield, the 2 parts of the nuclear bomb factory. I've been the driver for plucky anti-nuclear campaigners who have locked themselves across the gates. Yes, a handful of amateurs can close down Britain's nuclear bomb factory for a whole day, and they've done it several times. Have you seen that on the mainstream news? No, of course not. And let's just think about that for a moment. Britain's nuclear bomb factory is in special measures from the Health and Safety Executive. You can see Burfield from the M4 as you drive past Reading. They're making nuclear warheads 8 times the destructive power of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and they're being hauled up on health and safety. It is a nuclear bomb factory. What could possibly go wrong? So it's taken a long time to dismantle the conditioning and propaganda I was exposed to in my youth, almost a lifetime. I wish I'd learned critical thinking. I wish I'd heard about Chomsky and the propaganda model of the media, and how industries like nuclear spend a big slice of their budget on public relations. So a big thanks to you, Nikki Clark. While working together on the campaign against Hinkley Nuclear Power Station, you've done so much to open my eyes to how the propaganda from the nuclear industry really works. Not many people died at Chernobyl. Fukushima, perfectly safe for people to move back to their homes. Nuclear power, oh, how many times have I heard it called green energy, or low carbon, or even slip of the tongue, zero carbon. But if they don't know how to keep the waste safe for eternity, how can they calculate the carbon footprint? Of course they can't. And we're all indebted to Andy and Phil, who have revealed why our government is bunging billions of our money into the new generation of nuclear power stations at Hinkley Point C in Somerset and, God forbid, around the country. So I'll finish by talking about Trident. Just one Trident submarine has enough firepower to kill something like 45 million people. That's off the scale of wrongness. And the government wants to spend over £100 billion of our money upgrading it. At a time like this, when money would be so much better spent on reversing the austerity cuts, feeding our hungry children, funding the NHS, or fighting climate change. And that's total madness. So let's hope that gatherings like these can help spread the word on how we can stop it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Roland. So, hi everyone. I have a little presentation myself, just a very short, trying to cram 10 years of what's gone on into 10 minutes is a big challenge. So I have to say, well done, you guys, for delivering all that great information. So I'm just going to tell you all a little bit about what's going on with Hinkley and who I am, and then we're just going to have a little 5-minute comfort break so everyone can boil the kettle quickly and grab a cup of tea, and then we'll get stuck into the fantastic questions that are coming in. So you have to bear with me a little bit while I flip between, just find the slides that I want. A moment. And put that into slideshow mode, and then bear with me while I talk myself through. I'm getting old, I forget what I'm doing if I don't say what I'm doing while I'm doing it. Isn't that terrible? Okay, and then I think if I click share screen, that screen, there we go. Now, I'm just realizing that if I share my screen for a long time, I can't look at my notes, which is great, isn't it? The joys of getting used to doing webinars. So I've just put this slide up for a moment, and I'll pause sharing in a second. But this slide really addresses what Roland was just talking about the propaganda and the nuclear industry. You know, we do have like a bit of a David and Goliath situation in terms of funding and resources, let's say, when you look at the fact that this industry can wield academia, politicians, the media, corporations, and people like myself, who I'm just an ordinary mum who lives in a really rural place that's very concerned about a technology that's deployed in my community. So that just gives you a thing of the challenges that we face. So just look for my notes a moment. So Phil and Andy have just done a great job of outlining some of the history of what's gone on with policy in the last 10 years. And it's been a really interesting time. I first met Phil, I think at a Hinckley meeting some years ago at the beginning of all of this. And it's been interesting to see it unfold. So the Generation 3 designs that they want to build at Hinckley is called a European pressurized reactor. First construction, as has been said, began in Finland, Olkiluoto. Then it was Flamanville, France, then Taishan in China. And then finally plans for Hinckley, Sizewell, and some EPRs in India also. It's not the first time that we've fought off nuclear power plants in Somerset, and we had a fight here 20 years ago against a planned Hinkley Point C. UK policy began turning in the early noughties, and the policy direction was then set nuclear on a collision course with renewables, and that was in full swing by 2006. By around 2000, 2008, 2009, Hinkley Point C had to become once again the staple of the Stop Hinckley campaign, which for the last 20 years had managed to dedicate itself to fighting off the existing reactors. In 2010-11, preliminary permission was granted to EDF. And so we foresee that in action then the first distortion of nuclear policy, because the planning system was changed just so that it could consent the project. So we had this weird situation where what is normally a whole planning process for a project, which is all together, that was salami sliced, so that the argument went, climate change is so important, we need to start building this thing before we've even got permission. It's that important. So they got permission to build the foundations of the station as a standalone project, as if there was never going to be anything else on top of it. However, we got to see very quickly, as we knew, or as I felt I knew, that EDF had no commitment to climate change, because after getting that consent, they spent several years dilly-dallying and not bothering to begin building, because they wanted to make sure that they had secured all the funding that they wanted. So as pressing as the issue was, they weren't going to put their money where their mouth was. And as Vincent de Rivas from EDF promised us, we'd be cooking our dinner, Christmas dinner, with electricity from Hinkley Point C by 2017. Now, construction doesn't formally start on a nuclear project, until they pour the first concrete. So that actually happened in 2016. In 2012, just to hop back slightly, there was a report produced by Unlock Democracy and the Association of Energy Conservation, and it was called A Corruption in Governance. And this outlined how the modelling from Redpoint had been fudged in order to give the answer that was wanted, because we had 2 policy reviews of energy which left the back door open deliberately for nuclear. So again, that's another example of the distortion of this military technology on our energy policy. Hinkley Point C now has just announced another £500 million onto the budget, so we're now looking at 23 billion. The latest excuse for the latest tranche of delays is the lockdown, but I mean, these are the most delayed types of technology ever built. And if anyone who's concerned about climate change has any doubts, 10 years ago, and I mean 10 years ago, we were standing here making these same arguments about how important it was about climate change, except then there was at least a government policy and a plan to insulate all the homes and housing stock in the UK. That was all rolled back. It was also known, Chatham House were having presentations where they were talking, and they knew that nuclear is not part of a mix with renewables. It competes with them directly. It will take all of the money for renewables, and we've seen that. We've seen here in Somerset, grid capacity reserved. If you have a renewable project, you can't even get on the grid, and this is like, you know, 10 years before anything's even going to start generating. They keep space on the grid, you know, keep renewables off it. And now we're also having an attack on renewables on community energy projects, which some of the people in Salisbury CND can tell you more about. Now, in order to elucidate just exactly what's gone on over the last 10 years, because it's such an amazing amount of things, I'm just going to quote from a little bit from a report by Stephen Thomas into the finances, because this gives you a bit of an overview of the finances and some of the corruption. So in 2013, when the Hinkley Point C deal was outlined, it seemed very attractive to EDF. EDF still believed that the problems with the EPR design could be overcome. It had negotiated a 35-year fixed price deal based on a construction cost that was more than double that expected for the single EPRs being built at Okoloto and Flamanville. The crucial barrier of obtaining finance appeared to have been solved by the UK's government offer to guarantee all the credit needed to build the plant. This meant that borrowing would be possible at very low interest rates, reflecting the credit rating of the British government. So there's another example of this distortion. Why should this private company get the benefit of the UK government's credit rating and government guarantees? Because we were all promised at the outset that there would be no public money going into these projects. We were promised that it would all be done with private money. 2 years on, when the deal was further negotiated, the picture had changed dramatically, and not for the better. The only positive development for the nuclear industry was that the project had survived the European Commission's state aid investigation. Another example of the distortion that Phil and Andy discuss. And what happened in the European Commission was that you know, they moved heaven and earth. They moved people, actually, is what they did, which is what they always do. They got rid of people who were in charge of this, that part of the commission, and put their people in charge to make sure that Hinkley would survive the state aid investigation. And it's interesting to see that now we've had Brexit, and now that we've left Europe, that influence of British military policy on Europe is lifting. And I know that supporters of nuclear energy called it a bizarre decision in Europe, for Europe to be deciding that they don't want to build any new nukes in Poland, and maybe they'll do some other things there. So the cost and time schedules for Hinkley Point C were increasing, and investment partners that would have left EDF's shares had not emerged, leaving EDF with 2/3 of the project. So the cost and delays at Okoloto, Flamanville and Taishan had escalated, and even the optimists within EDF about the EPR must have had increased doubts about the viability of the design. Now, this is what Steve wrote when he wrote his report. I can confirm that the EDF did have concerns about the viability of the project, and in fact they suppressed them in order to carry on, and that was revealed recently by a public court of audit in France, and there was an article in the Times. I have a link here, and when I'm not speaking I'll pop it into the chat box. So Areva's safety culture was clearly weak and its credibility was at rock bottom following the discovery of long-term quality control failings. And this again is another example of distortion on policy and on practice, because this was Le Creusot in France. Le Creusot in France manufacture nuclear safety critical components and other things. And it turns out that it's not only the EPR reactor pressure vessels that they cast and then fudged the documents on in order to install it in Flamanville, but they've been doing that for 20 or 30 years, it turns out. So these quality control problems went on, and in fact some of that stuff is still playing out. And so this led to EDF. They didn't have enough money to deal with the maintenance they needed to do in their own fleet. Then they had this kind of PR and safety issue around the Creusot parts that have been installed. We're talking nuclear safety critical components that have been wrongly manufactured, and then the reports, safety reports, fudged. So then they have the issue of trying to replace, if they can, some of these components. So actually what EDF did is EDF owned the national grid, the electricity infrastructure in France, and that nest egg was actually there to pay for the decommissioning of the French nuclear reactors. But what they did is EDF had a fire sale to get rid of non-core assets, and amongst that was their grid. So quite how EDF are planning to put any money by for any of their responsibilities for the back end of the waste in France is at this point unknown. And so things that are going on at Hinkley, we've had an ongoing campaign about the mud dumping, because they're dredging mud from the estuary around the reactors. We believe, and with good reason, that this will have contaminants from years and years of isotopes pouring out into the estuary. There's an ongoing campaign. There's already been mud dumped, and there's still an ongoing campaign to stop further dumping. You can check the Stop Hinkley website for that. And then the most latest thing is that EDF had to agree to putting acoustic speakers, for want of a better word, fish deterrents, because they want to directly cool these nuclear reactors with water from the Severn estuary, which will also raise the temperature of the water going back into the Severn estuary, which will also have an effect on the fish. But this water cooling system will take tons and tons of water and fish per second. And so the hope with the acoustic deterrent was to keep some of the fish away and stop them from being sacrificed. However, EDF have decided that that's too expensive for them, and now that they'd like not to do that, and they've just done some new environmental impact assessments to try and prove that that's not needed. So that's another little fight that's going on. And I just heard today in the news that even the nuclear workers aren't that happy, because they're being fleeced, and EDF were occupied by lots of their workers today over some of the scandals over the recruitment of electricians at Hinkley. So you can all look that up in your news as well. Oh, and the other thing that happened, let me go back to my slides a moment. Here we go, new share. There we go. And I don't know if you can all see that, hopefully you can, but this is the concrete silos at Hinkley in a state of collapse. So the builders can't even build the infrastructure they need to build the plant without having some health and safety disasters. So there we go. Now let me just bring myself back to the webinar, stop the share. There we go. So that was just my little update on trying to cram 10 years of Hinkley, and that's not even discussing the protests that we've done, which are there behind me. I'll start off with a question from a lady called Kayla Ent, who asks, what about the national security threat of sharing our nuclear intelligence by developing Hinkley C with China? The higher our debt to China, the greater our vulnerability. Is this an issue? So would any of our panelists like to address that? Go on, Andy.
I could have a quick go. Yes. In the case of Hinkley, it's money really. It's financing was what was under discussion. In Bradwell, then there's more involvement, and then a possible onward plan from that with the Chinese designed reactors. And yeah, I mean, it's an issue. It's a really a sign of how pressurized the international nuclear industry is. And when I say nuclear industry, I mean the military and civil industry, because they are basically much more one thing than we realize. And you can't really explain the way things play out around the world without seeing them as one thing and seeing it as an industry trying to survive globally when both its power options and its weapons options are increasingly seen as obsolete. We can talk about that more. And the paradox that you see one nuclear weapon state relying on another nuclear weapon state to keep its nuclear infrastructure viable is a sign of what's really going on, that it's not about country versus country. It's about a massive global industry against often its home governments and its home citizens to keep itself going. That's the only way you can explain this kind of dependency between supposedly quite adversarial states like UK and China.
Fantastic. Okay. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add to that question? Okay, we'll move on. Here's another good one. It says, I'm not sure of the person's name, but they ask, or they say, it appears that much of the DARPA and similar funding for mini nukes and microgrids is aimed at providing power for next generation beam weapons and related terrestrial and space force requirements and justification for a new round of enriched plutonium-238, etc., for space nuclear batteries and propulsion expansion. How might microgrids be disentangled from nuke policy and the next generation technology be effectively countered before they further hijack the sustainability agenda? Who would like to take that question? Anybody?
I don't want to be Mr. Big Mouth. Phil, do you want to pick up or?
You go first and I'll...
Yeah, okay. It's a great question. And sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person.
No, they just say DD on the...
Oh, okay, well, thanks, VD. I think you're really on an emerging issue. At the moment, for reasons Phil especially outlined, it's really clear that the real big driver of the pressure to keep civil nuclear power is from submarine, and in the US and France, broader naval propulsion. They have aircraft carriers and other ships propelled by nuclear reactors as well in those countries. So it's naval propulsion is driving it now. But on the horizon, coming along very quick, as you said in your question, are directed energy weapons, basically lasers and other high energy weapons for anti-aircraft and other use from space and from the ground. So the vision of the military is to put battlefield nuclear reactors in position so they can power these new generation weapons. That's the vision that the US Army in particular is quite open about. So it's not a major factor now, I think, but I think it's coming along and the military is aware of it. And it's another reason why the British government and others are becoming so entrenched in nuclear, because they tie them together, but they won't talk about it. And how to get rid of it, I think we basically just need to recognize, smell the coffee, that both nuclear power on the civil side and on the military side are obsolete. And things go obsolete routinely. It's just up to culture in general to recognize when they've gone obsolete. And we just have to somehow convey that message in effective ways to the system. And they'll go the way other military obsolete technologies have gone in the past.
Yeah, I just add a kind of broad point about just really the role of the military in, and it's quite a sad fact, in sort of different waves of innovation, and particularly with nuclear. And of course, the nuclear thing started as a wave coming out of the Second World War. And it seems with these new weapons systems and so on, with regards to advanced nuclear, the next horizon of military conflict, you know, space is the next frontier, literally, with regards to military tactics and warfare and these weapons and so on. And again, it looks like this new wave of means of waging violence could again be part of what propels nuclear. And so I think a broader point is really to, you know, it's important to see just how connected so-called civil systems are with military, and make that transparent and challenge that. Yeah, so that's just a point about that, really.
Bear with me while I remember to unmute myself before I speak. Okay, back to the questions. So the couple that came up just in relation to some stuff you said, and I'm just trying to connect them together. I think there might be two different questioners, or maybe the same questioner. So it's addressed to Phil, and it's an anonymous questioner who asked, could Phil address Zion Lights' position advocating with Extinction Rebellion prior to her employment by Environmental Progress? Does she still hold that position? And then the other question asks, does Zion Lights still work for Michael Schellenberger?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer that. And the simple answer is, I don't know those finer details. It was what I'd suggest people do is, there is an article by Extinction Rebellion, which is the place to look into the specifics of that, where they address in detail Zion Lights' position that she held, and give their own perspective on that. It certainly the case that Environmental Progress UK was set up, and that is a group from Michael Schellenberger. So that was the case. But I think, so people can go and find out those finer details. That's not me to answer. But to emphasize the point about Zion is, it's kind of quite clear that this repentant critic narrative has been used routinely by nuclear proponents. I mean, Michael Schellenberger has almost based a career around it. Huge amounts of media coverage, and it appears time and time again. And what I'd say to people is, it's quite easy to find out if you look just a little bit, that it's doubtful whether in recent times they had a position that was anti-nuclear at all. So I think the important thing here to do is to call a spade, and really see a common strategy for what it is, and to call it out on that. But what is astounding is how much media coverage it gets in Britain, because it's not really much of a story if you think about it. Somebody changes their mind on nuclear, yet it's covered in the Mail, in the Sun, in the BBC. Why is it that is such a newsworthy thing, when it is so difficult to get substantial issues about nuclear covered in the British press? That's the real issue that we need to talk about.
Unmute myself again. So, and then another question that we have. So we had some questions sent in ahead of the webinar as well, and for people who couldn't make it. And one of those says, I'm concerned that school pupils, such as sixth formers, are getting biased information about the nuclear industry to encourage them into the job sector. They have a very one-sided view and don't seem to know anything about risks or waste, but think nuclear power will be a safe, low-carbon source of electricity. Can any of the panelists address that concern? So I suppose they're asking about the bias in the information. And
Roland's got his hand up.
Oh, yep, sorry, beg your pardon, looking at the questions. Go for it, Roland.
Well, thanks. I mean, I speak as one of those. I mean, as a kid who trusted the BBC, the media, my school teachers, I'm sure they were honest people, but they were reproducing what they were fed, what information was fed to them. I remember being taken, a trip out up to Bristol University from my comprehensive school, where they gave us a talk about nuclear power. And they did actually say electricity so cheap, they won't bother to meter it. And in Britain, I mean, then struggling with post-war austerity, people struggling to heat their homes with very inefficient coal fires. I mean, that was the situation then. I know it probably feels like the Dark Ages compared with now. But, we believed what we were told. Your teachers are authority figures. The media, you assume speaks the truth until you can see through it and dismantle the way in which media bias works. I mentioned Chomsky and the propaganda model. Look it up, get wised up, look at examples of how it works. Unfortunately, we're being bombarded with it all the time, as well as sort of public relations exercises, advertising, and so on and so forth. These are big industries. You know, there's 100 years of experience of public relations now, and you know, they're very good at it. And you've got to do your research. I mean, you know, as Pilger says, the truth is only 3 clicks away with a mouse. Do your research. And young people, I do trust their intelligence and their savviness, that they're much better at researching and being cynical and being a little bit distrusting. And I want to find out for myself. Go and do your research. Don't believe what you're being told. You can't always trust the obvious sources. So that's my answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to interject a little bit there. I dropped some links into the chat box earlier about just about that, about doing your research, because, you know, supporters of nuclear energy, that's Sir McAlpine and Bernard Ingham. Bernard Ingham was Margaret Thatcher's press secretary. He is the guy that went on the offensive with, you know, loads of money from BNFL to rubbish wind farms over the last 20 years. And that's why we got a massive NIMBY movement. It wasn't because people didn't actually want wind farms. They were made to feel that way. That was done deliberately. And the evidence of this is everywhere. SourceWatch is really good. It links up lots of these, shows you the people who are involved with big like front groups, and it shows you how to do research for yourself. Because I mean, I've got a degree, Phil's got a degree, Andy's got a degree, Roland's got a degree. We know how to do research, but obviously sometimes if you sat at home and it's really hard to work out what to do. So do have a look at those links that we put up so that you can work out how to do things for yourself. Andy, yes?
Yeah, just to build on those great points you made, Nikki and Roland made, about the importance of people power. I think this concern that the industry, the nuclear industry had, both military and civil, about what young people are choosing to do with their careers is a really crucial thing, because people power changes things in many ways. I mean, there's the obvious thing of mobilization and direct actions and just campaigning, like you guys, and I've been involved in that, and Phil's been involved in it in different ways ourselves. That's crucial. That changes the climate. It's also building new industries entirely. Cutting a long story short, we would not have commercial wind power in the world now had it not been for Denmark under the radar of the global nuclear industry, allowing it to develop. You can show that really clearly, how it failed in Sweden, failed in Britain, failed in Germany, failed in Japan, failed in USA, failed because the industry said it can't work. It worked in Denmark, a non-nuclear country with an anti-nuclear policy, where activists developed the early technologies from which the wind came. And then now, just the importance, the government is so concerned about skills for the nuclear base because people are voting with their feet. Engineers want to go into renewables, but BAE Systems and the government wants them to go into the nuclear industry. And in the end, I think that's a very important way of changing things, but not only by political action, by innovation, but also by voting with your feet in where you take your career.
Well said. And just to say that I thought I had some documents ready and I was all ready for dropping them into the chat box. I haven't realized that I can't actually drop the documents directly into the chat box. So sorry about being a little bit technology, not understanding there. What I actually need is web links for them. So, because I have some documents that are from the nuclear industry about just this, about their PR plans and about their recruitment plans. You know, I live in a community where 50% of the educational effort that's made about nuclear is made in my community, more so than in a community that doesn't host these facilities. Why is that? Because they want our people in these communities going into these industries. They want to be able to recruit there. So the propaganda in the schools is heavier. You know, the big issue that the nuclear industry deems that it faces is public acceptance. And that's really where all its effort is. And they're well ready to drop the climate change argument, and you know, they're always like one step ahead. You know, they've been talking about dropping the climate change argument since 2015, but you know, here we are with them still doing all of that. And just to come back to some of the questions now, we've got some questions about small modular reactors coming in. Just bear with me a moment while I find the one that I just saw. Here we go. Robert Forsyth, if the cost of nuclear is so high and its impact on energy generation are negative because of diversion of money and time, and if its hidden purpose is to support military nuclear power, why is Bill Gates' TerraPower investing so much in alternative, greener nuclear power? Does anyone want to deal with that one?
I mean, the honest answer is I don't know what makes somebody like Bill Gates tick. I don't know him, so it'd be speculation on my part. But I think there is a wider culture, especially as a sort of macho, patriarchal, colonial culture that underlies a lot of techno geekery. I can't say anything about Bill Gates himself, but I can say there's a tendency for that kind of attitude to prevail among, you know, for instance, I mean, just the gendered part of it. I mean, there's others probably here know better than me. Men of my, I'm nearly 60. Men of my generation are much more prone to these kinds of thinking about, you have to control, you have to concentrate power. If you want energy, you have to have it in a really macho way. That kind of thinking, it goes with our culture, it goes with patriarchy. It's not just these direct military links and PR at work. But you also, I mean, it's a long established trend, and I can't speak for Gates again, whereby billionaires are very useful sources of supply of resources. If you manage to nobble a billionaire and get them to spend money, then you're doing a very effective thing if you're coming from a marginal industry. So the same kinds of dynamic we see in play in the ways Phil was documenting can be working among these super elite people as well. But whether that's the case or not with Bill Gates, I can't say.
Okay. Oops. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Does anybody? Oh, right, let's just get back into this before I get ahead of myself. Bear with me a moment while I find the next question. Here's another one. So this is directly about the small modular reactors. What is harmful about the small nuclear reactors that they are researching? Nuclear energy can also be used for good in medicine, X-ray, and fusion. Right. Anybody like to speak to that? Roland?
Can I just answer the medical applications here? A friend challenged me on exactly this question, and the medical side, which I worked on, which would be therapy as well as imaging, can all be done without nuclear power. You can make the radioisotopes for imaging and for therapy without needing to put stuff into the power stations. There are other clean production facilities that can be used for that. So the two are separate. We don't need big nuclear power stations making things and byproducts and such like. You know, the two are separate. So somebody who's worked in nuclear medicine, which is imaging, and I'm aware of the therapy side as well, you know, I can answer that very clearly. You know, we're not dependent on the power industry to provide that technology. Thank you.
Well, Andy?
Well, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to, I guess, a point on the non-medical front about the risks of small modular reactors. I mean, many of the claims made that they, you know, reduce proliferation risk and these kind of things really don't stand up to scrutiny. I mean, the most credible small modular reactor designs are scaled down PWRs, and all of the issues that relate to large existing reactors relate to small modular reactors. And in fact, you know, it could be argued that if there's spread out more and these kind of things, then the security implications could in fact be more serious. And one thing about the risks is it has been said that if they are to be in any way economically viable, and they would still be a lot more expensive than renewables, they'll have to be located next to large population centers so you can use them for district heating and these kind of things. And you got to ask yourself, is that a risk that people are going to be willing to live with? So I think none of the substantive issues with nuclear are solved by small modular reactors.
And just in line with what just been said, another part of the question was on fusion, and it's often raised. So just to very quickly address that, fusion is really the same basic dilemma that we've discussed in relation to small and advanced modular reactors on steroids. It's been around as a prospect since the mid-50s. It was in 1957, it was projected to be 30 years in the future, and it has remained or exceeded 30 years in the future for the past half century, constantly moving ahead. I mean, this is not a partisan point. This is just the history of it.
Yeah.
There are now a new wave of claims. They always come around. It may be that it will come on form in some form, but claims made that it avoids proliferation are false. You can breed fissile materials in the blankets. It produces large amounts of intermediate level waste, different spectrum of waste than normal, but it still presents those sort of challenges. It's part of a nuclear industrial complex used by the military, and the safety concerns are there from that radioactive materials. And it also produces tritium, which is only now beginning to become realized as a potentially major public health concern as well. Following the Fukushima accident, it's been realized that tritium isn't quite what we thought, and that's a basic material used in fusion. So we can't say for sure what the issues are, but it certainly isn't relevant to climate change on the targets we have now. And there's evidence is that it presents all the same problems that nuclear power does. We have to ask why there's such a massively more is spent on fusion than renewable research put together. And that's a really peculiar situation.
Would anyone like to add to that? Roland?
If I can come back in on that, I mean, I'm probably the oldest person here, and all my life they've been talking about fusion is just around the corner. And they're still talking about fusion is just around the corner, just bung us loads of money, and this time it's going to work. Well, as we know, as was said earlier, we've got till 2030 to substantially decarbonize our energy source. And fusion is pie in the sky off in the future. If the conventional nuclear power stations can't be made to work, what hope is there for something that's experimental and very novel? If it's going to work, we'll deal with that when we've done it, when we dealt with all the immediate problems. But they are very severe, and we need to deal with them by conventional things like home insulation and renewables. The technology is there, so we don't need to be distracted. Thank you.
Okay. So back to the questions that I've got here. That's right, 2 places to keep an eye on them. And
Nikki, sorry to butt in. While you're saying that, I mean, my memory as a kid is I was brainwashed by the space program and by big science and gee whiz stuff, as I call it. And fusion falls into that category. It blinds young people, and I have to say, particularly young boys. And it's a terrible distraction. The answers are much more simple and close to home. And as was being said by the other speakers, distributed local solutions, not these big concentrated power sources, which of course have got the obvious commercial advantage that they want to make the stuff and then sell it to everybody else. And that's not the way to go. Thank you. So
I have another question from another anonymous person who's maybe in the United States. It's a bit of a long one, but it says, in the US, FBI investigations have revealed widespread nuclear industry bribery and corruption, resulting in state legislature and nuclear leadership resignations and indictments in Illinois, Ohio, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania so far, as well as the booting of the leadership of Exelon, the largest nuclear utility, and halting some nuclear expansion that has been based in bogus data and payola under cover of clean energy. These cross-border legislative bills, lobbying and bribery agendas were cooked up through organisations like ALEC, but specific to the nuclear industry, well documented through the Centre for Media and Democracy, the partner organisation to the SourceWatch project you've cited. These are transnational nuclear corporations and lobbying networks, allegedly using similar tactics in the UK, EU and elsewhere. How are investigations and prosecutions emerging and coordinated worldwide on this, given the evidence now emerging? Interpol, ? Parliamentary, ? Andy?
Yeah, I think it's a really, I mean, people should check out these. They're very well documented there in that question, what's happening in the US. It is a massive fraud, the equal to anything that's been seen. But it's not just in the US. France has got a massive fraud, in fact, two massive fraud cases associated in the nuclear industry, one with urano and to do with uranium supplies, one to do with the falsification of safety certificates from the Le Creusot forge, where they make the pressurized water reactors that are, I mean, there's questions around the supply chain for the UK designs if they were built. And in Germany, that some of the biggest corporate fraud cases in Germany were Nuchem and to do with plutonium, going back many years now. So there is a propensity. I don't think we have to invoke we have to demonize people. It's nothing to do with the people who are as well motivated, generally speaking, as anyone else, and Roland can speak to this, in the nuclear industry. It's not that there's bad people. It's the industry is secret and nasty things happening under the kinds of secrecy and deception that we've been trying to document. When an industry habituates itself to handling things that way, then it's a hotbed for corruption. All industries can be prone to corruption, renewables can be too, but they're far more open, there's far more defenses against that happening. So even the civil nuclear industry is so closed. When you add the military nuclear industry, it's a very unhealthy atmosphere for that kind of thing to happen.
Just to add very briefly that, of course, in the UK, there's been incidents to do with fraud as well. Of course, the falsification of documents around MOX sales with Japan in the early 2000s. But I think a broader point, and I'm very careful here this is not saying this is corruption, but I think a very interesting thing is to compare in the UK, for example, the way that deals are done bilaterally with government and EDF to agree a strike price behind closed doors, all these kind of things. It's a very different way of working than a sort of open and transparent process with regards to the costings and deals with renewables. So I think there is something to think about there in terms of the relationship between government and industry and how that differs with other technologies.
Okay. And so I'm going to take another question that we were sent in ahead of the webinar. And it says, I don't know who it's from. We were told that we need nuclear power because of intermittency gaps when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. Why then is National Grid turning off wind farms at vast cost and paying EDF Energy millions of pounds to try to lower output from its nuclear power stations? Go on, Andy.
Well, yeah, I'll have a quick rush. I mean, these things can get very technical to do with the grid codes and the kinds of contracts. But in a nutshell, in every single aspect of the way the British energy system runs, and especially the electricity system, nuclear is privileged. Research and development, contracts, finance, grid codes, operating regimes, you name it, funding systems, you name it. Nuclear has a privileged status. Regulatory systems, liability, it's got its own liability law to protect it, waste management, decommissioning, everywhere, every aspect of industrial activity, the nuclear industry is feather bedded. And one of those is the one this question is pointing to, that when nuclear is giving an output, put it in simple terms, that if there's a surplus, it's the renewables who have to switch off and take a hit, not the nuclear, for no better reason than the system is designed to privilege nuclear. And that's that kind of entrenched privileging of this technology that Phil and I and so many others are asking questions about. Why are we treating this industry in this way?
Yeah. Phil, did you want to add anything to that?
No, not really. Other than, you know, this argument about intermittency, as we've stated in the presentation, you know, there's all kinds of solutions with storage, whether it's pumped hydro, thermal energy storage, compressed air, you know, and the cost reductions in storage technologies that are happening. That you know, that point of the question there that was mentioned is really, as we pointed out in the presentation, obsolete. There's ways of managing, and indeed the problem, as we're seeing in places like Scotland, is actually too much wind and so on. And you know, so there really isn't a problem there. You know, you get Scotland is a place where it's almost 100% of electricity consumption equivalent provided by wind energy alone for several months. So, you know, things are happening a lot more rapidly, and the system isn't keeping up.
So we had another question about small modular reactors that said, what's the difference between today's power plants and SRMs and ARMs? I'm assuming SRMs, they mean small modular reactors, and ARMs, they mean advanced modular reactors?
Yeah.
Go for it, Andy.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what's, and it's a good question. It's tricky to answer because actually SMR, small modular reactor, and AMR, advanced modular reactor, which is somewhat bigger, in fact, about the size of the early Magnox reactors at the upper end of the scale that we built in the 60s in the UK. So those two designs are really just about the modularity. The idea is you repeat the same design again and again, which in a way the French did anyway on large reactors through the 90s with their convoy system. But the idea is modular, so you don't incur these one-of-a-kind costs repeatedly. And then at the low end of the scale, you can construct these things at a factory like Rolls-Royce in Rainsway and Derby. We want to construct these things and then ship them on trucks to their sites. So after that, the particularities break down because there are so many different design traditions. I think I counted more than 20 currently really pushed. I mean, there's much more than that in principle, but just being pushed around the world at the moment. A real exotic menagerie of different kinds of design traditions in both AMR and SMR concepts. So you can't really generalize about the design. Some of them are radically different. But the history we've learned from nuclear, and it's kind of interesting, there are, after similar profusions of designs in the 60s, everything came back to mama in a way, in that we ended up through the 70s and into the 80s with two basic designs: gas graphite reactors and light water reactors. Basically, cutting a long story short, the light water reactors descend from submarine propulsion. They have a high power density. They're very unforgiving. And the gas graphite reactors and the tubular designs allow you to take the fuel out when it's not used up yet. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to recover plutonium. So they're basically the two design traditions that caught on in civilian power production were both military designs, despite hundreds of different designs that were possible. And now we're seeing with SMRs and AMLs the same basic pattern, that we can predict that the designs that will actually be settled on, if these things are allowed to really entrench, will be military designs for battlefield power provision or naval propulsion or space propulsion. Those will be the ones that then spin off, and we're saddled with them in energy systems at massive cost. It's the same pattern that we saw in the first generation.
I'd like to just intervene there, if I may, just because my understanding of the history, you know, when I've sort of done my homework and researched the nuclear industry, is that we do this thing of economy of scale, and it was those smaller modular reactors that, you know, the military reactors, the submarine reactors, they were the first reactor designs. And my understanding was to get power, to get an economy of scale, they scaled up. Well, why did they scale up? To make it economic. So how is scaling back down to that size going to be more economic than the big one? I just want to say, unless you know, the laws of thermodynamics and things like that have changed, and some of those things that make economics, or at least in this capitalist system, if that hasn't changed, then I would say that my argument would be that the only reason SMRs got talked about at all again is post-Fukushima. Post-Fukushima, we had a wave of the industry dredging back up any old crap that they could in the way of bad ideas that they'd had before, to try and say, don't worry, the future will be any other reactor other than the ones they built at Fukushima. And there will be no private interest, I can guarantee you, running to you know, there's NuScale are trying to get involved in the English market. But, you know, the bottom line is, just like EDF can't find any partners to finance Hinkley or Sizewell, you know, the only people willing to finance this stuff are states that want a military, China, UK, and they will be the only people that will fund SMRs. That will be the only way we'll actually see any SMRs built, will be because we have a policy that ignores, you know, the market actually on that. And just to come back to our list of questions, here's a good one. We were told that we'd need nuclear power because of, I think I did that, didn't I? No, I did that, sorry. Craig Adlard says, I have a question I would like to be asked if there is time. Have Andy or Phil reached out to or been asked by any media outlets for critical perspective on the role of nuclear in mitigation? If yes, has there been an open interest or resistance? I'm thinking many researchers tend to focus on how they might engage policymakers, but overlook how they might engage with publics. It seems that a new media landscape is emerging with Open Democracy, Novara and others, which have a stated aim of elevating critical perspectives, but which sometimes aren't achieving this as well when it comes to sustainability and mitigation contexts. Thank you. Andy, yep.
Yeah, have we reached out to the media? Yes. We have spent 4 years now, coming up for 4 years, intensively approaching the media. I mean, I used to work in NGOs. Phil's been doing this kind of thing for a long time. I'm not saying we're good at it, but we know how important that is, and we put a lot of energy into it to get this story out. And cutting a long story short, over that time, we spoke to the leading, and I think the count that when I last checked, 18 journalists in the UK, specialist journalists, of whom 2/3 picked the story up, the story that Phil especially, he and I summarized in our account today. 2/3 picked it up, called us back. We had long conversations, sometimes very long conversations with them. Of those, 3 ever took it forward. The vast majority were scotched at the editorial desk. For reasons I don't know, the reasons we were told was, this isn't a story, it's obvious, or it's a ridiculous conspiracy theory, which cancel each other out, actually. So it was only under peculiar circumstances with non-specialist journalists, initially Holly Watt, who was not an energy journalist, she's picked up from The Guardian. Then it was picked up by Roger Harrabin at the Today programme, and then we were going up to do an interview, shut down at the last minute from the editorial desk. Then he seemed to want to come back in again a bit later, and he did cover it, but he said he'd avoid the gatekeepers and put it out through the website. And then most recently, it was picked up Ambrose Evans Pritchard, which we're very pleased about, in the Telegraph, which is not our usual source. So those journalists picked it up, and they're very idiosyncratic circumstances that led to that. By and large, and including, sadly, we put it to websites like Open Democracy, you get interest, it goes. Now, there are many, many legitimate reasons for this. We can't point to any, but what I can say is the climate in the UK, with the kind of stories that Phil ended on, the amount of coverage that piles in on the back of those trivial stories about somebody supposedly changing their mind when they manifestly didn't, because you can document it, compared to this, which involved billions of pounds of diversion of public money, just not getting through that media screen unless something accidental happens. That's, for me, it's much more worrying than nuclear power itself. I thought I was hard-nosed. I don't live in the country I thought I lived in. This experience of trying to put that out. And there's some hairier stories than that we've got to tell as well, which are probably not appropriate to tell in a platform like this. But I don't recognize the country I live in from this experience for the last 3 years.
Just to add a little bit on top of that, in relation to Novara Media, and that is somewhere we could try. But I think picking up on what Andy was saying, talking about these media organizations new media organizations are very good and they do great stuff, but it is the broader climate of the UK. And in terms of the left, if you want to call it that, and I've engaged a lot with the Labour Party, and it is almost impossible, I find, to really get the nuclear issue discussed in any substantial way. It seems to be an assumed, sorry, my camera keeps going off. It seems to be an assumed feature of British culture that, or at least English and Welsh culture, that there will always be nuclear and we always need to build new nuclear, and it's just not questioned. And it's not questioned on the left. And remember what happened with Jeremy Corbyn and so on. He had to pretend to suddenly be in favor of nuclear to placate the unions, to placate the base. In terms of Westminster, it is essentially impossible to be critical towards nuclear and stand a chance of getting in office. And that seems to percolate out towards all kinds of grassroots organizations who just don't discuss the issue. So it is this broader cultural thing that's going on that Andy's talking about.
And if it's all right, I wouldn't mind just chipping in on that because, yeah, you know, I don't recognise the country I live in either. I'm just a concerned mom. That's got me on the domestic extremist database for my activism. I don't recognise the country at all. I've done loads of media work as part of the campaigning that we've done. I think I did about 60 interviews saying that the project had been consented on 60 different occasions because, you know, they were always consenting it. Well, they only ever consented it once. So why do we need to hear that repeatedly repeated, you know? And yeah, the industry has its tentacles into everything. And that's a particular strategy. And I just want to come back to this issue of, it's not just the government and like that slide that I showed of, you know, it's academia, politics. It's also one of these people in the questions has called me a conspiracy theorist for what I said earlier about the grid being reserved for projects. I think the thing is, because of what I do, people approach me. I have workers approach me, nuclear industry workers approach me, and in fact I got one of them to speak out. Peter Smith, he was an engineer at Hinkley A, and we had him speak at one of our protests because I encouraged him to. This industry gets into everywhere. Extinction Rebellion, I haven't been personally involved with Extinction Rebellion because my issue is this issue. But what did I have? And I'm also a member of the Green Party, and Phil, you addressed this Greens for Nuclear Power appearing. Well, the first thing they did before they did that is we, in the Green Party, we actually make our policy at conference, unlike the Labour Party and the Tory Party. It's a very democratic and messy sometimes process, but our policy making process has always traditionally in the Green Party included Green Party members. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw an amendment pop up at one of our conferences, which was a pro-nuclear person who joined the Green Party just for that reason, trying to get through a minor amendment our policy direction on nuclear change. Now, it got struck down because you can't use a minor amendment to make a major change on policy. So what did they do? Because I've watched them the whole time. They went away and they made their little forums, you know, green, like oh, maybe nuclear's green. And they got, you know, some people like to join the party and to start having those conversations on digital forums. Now we actually have people running for leadership contenders in the Green Party who are pro-nuclear. How did that happen? That wouldn't have happened before the Green Surge, wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. And then Extinction Rebellion, I've had anti-nuclear campaigners from all over the country contact me. This is about a year ago, so I know you can see it for yourself. So basically, I had campaigners from all the Extinction Rebellion groups were supposed to be decentralized, so they were all under their own control, and just, you know, working in the communities that they operate in. Now, Roland, you've been very involved in Extinction Rebellion, so I'm sure in Bristol it maybe has a different flavour. But certainly what's been observed around the country is anti-nuclear campaigners go onto Facebook to raise the issue in a forum. Now, Extinction Rebellion is talking about climate change, and if nuclear is the way forward, then it should be really easy to have a conversation about what the technologies are. But actually, anyone trying to raise the nuclear industry, they were moderated out of existence. And so these people were contacting me, sending me screenshots and things of the conversations they were having, and I was funneling that to people in Extinction Rebellion saying, what's going on? Now, do I think that it's a coincidence that all of these disparate Extinction Rebellion groups just happen to have a pro-nuclear person doing their PR? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The nuclear industry made sure, you know, like they've got their Zion lights or whoever, they made sure that they've got their people in these places. These are parts of their strategies. You know, that's why Westminster's so impenetrable. And they're trying to make the activist world impenetrable to us. And we can't allow that to happen. So I just feel really strongly that I needed to say that. Andy?
Yeah, may I come in, because I think it's or did you want to say something, Roland?
No, that's okay. You carry on.
On this point, because I think it is crucial. I mean, Phil and I made it. It's worth just mentioning again. Whatever side, when one is involved, you always are in any setting with people who say, "Well, it can't be that bad," you know. And what about all these environmentalists who are turning around? the crucial question is, for decades, we had really active major national organizations, for instance, on nuclear. We had a really much more critical commentary in the British media and in the big NGOs in London on nuclear for decades. Just at the point when the economics drops down. So now there is no argument on the economics of nuclear. It really is a basket case economically. And after Fukushima, when George Monbiot, just a few days afterwards, comes out, just when two of the biggest disasters occur to nuclear, so strangely, you get this rise in pro-nuclear commentary. Now, you can't point fingers at any individuals, organizations, or people, because it's a complicated world. Everyone has a right to change their view. And, these issues are ambiguous and so on. So I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying, how can it be that when the fate of the nuclear industry has been the worst it's ever been, the advocacy is more intense than it's ever been? It really is strange. And if you think that's a conspiracy argument, Phil and I got called conspiratorial all the time with our argument in the early times. We're not being called it now that Macron has admitted it, that the US has admitted it. Strangely, they don't. But Michael Schellenberger, who we mentioned before, because Lion Lights works for him, Michael Schellenberger's organization wrote a blog when we first came out with our analysis of the military links, calling us mad conspiracy theorists. You can still see this. Then a short while later, it went quiet. We kept documenting it. The same organization, Michael Schellenberger, the same person who called us mad conspiracy theorists, wrote a big piece in Forbes magazine saying the links with the military are crucial because the military nuclear infrastructure is keeping world peace. And he had charts and diagrams showing as nuclear weapons go up, peace goes up, fewer people die in war. It's really actually, I think, quite obscene. But nonetheless, he made so you can see how the PR system works. It calls you a conspiracy theorist until that credibility evaporates, and then it flips in that case, and the media don't pick it up. Zion Lights works for that organization who did that. It's on the public record, and yet she gets airtime whenever she wants. It's really quite chilling.
Yeah. So we're getting close towards the end of our webinar. So just on that subject, I think it will be on the closing slide, but on the Southwest Against Nuclear website, we've got a permanent link to an article that was produced by Ethical Consumer called Nuclear Chain Reactions, which outlined in 2006 what their PR strategy was going to go. I would advise anyone that wants to call me or Andy or Phil or Roland or anybody else who's concerned about nuclear issues, conspiracy theorists, to go back and read those documents. Read the documents that the industry produced themselves. It's all there. It's hidden in plain sight. And so we're going to take this final question and then we're going to close the webinar. And this last question says, if governments are saying they need nuclear power to meet their net zero commitments for climate change, how is carbon footprint calculated for nuclear power generation at the moment? And does this need to change? Go on, Andy.
I don't want to barge in, but I've worked on this, and actually, this is a chance to make I barely dare do it, but a favourable point towards nuclear power, because I've worked for 20 years on carbon accounting systems and risk assessment systems and input-output systems and all these methods for quantifying impacts and pros and cons of different energy technologies. And the bottom line through all these methods is you can get any answer you like out of them within the bounds of rigor provided by the disciplines. You can justify any ranking order you like across the technologies. There's a whole nother story to this, but for instance, take nuclear infrastructures where the steel and all the inputs and the fuel enrichment, the mining equipment is all powered by electricity, which is nuclear, would have a very different carbon footprint than nuclear starting in an economy we have now. So we should be very cautious about these precise numbers. And I'm making here a point, we shouldn't say there's a precise number to the carbon impact of renewables or nuclear. We should be talking about it in much more democratic ways about the issues that we think are important and be accountable for it, because these numbers conceal all kinds of assumptions. Both the numbers used by the nuclear industry, but also sometimes the numbers used against them are spuriously precise. So the answer to the question how they calculated is very opaquely, and typically the assumptions are far more volatile than they seem. But that doesn't mean that renewables aren't still the best way to reduce climate change. Because for reasons we gave in our talk, the costs and the speed are so much more effective than nuclear. It just means let's get bogged down in supposedly very precise technocratic arguments when we should feel much more empowered to talk about these things in common sense ways.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add to that?
Just very briefly, because I can see Sarah has say that I think
ready for us to stop. Yeah.
I just to back up what Andy says, to not get bogged down in these technical arguments. And another thing that strikes me about the case of the UK, as you pointed out, Nikki, you know, for Hinkley C, there was an exceptional planning decision made to speed up the development, to make it happen, to say, and they gave a figure of, you know, if it's built by 2017, it will save an extra million, you know, tons of CO2 and everything like that. And the entire rationale for the UK's nuclear renaissance set out in 2008, 2011, it's failed. It's failed. There hasn't been a significant amount of 16 gigawatts of new nuclear built significantly before 2025. New nuclear has not contributed 1 kilowatt hour towards reducing emissions. And why is it that this doesn't seem to matter? It doesn't matter if the nuclear industry repeatedly fails. Well, why it is because it's not really about climate change. It's not about energy. It is about Britain sustaining an industry and a suite of capabilities. And unless that is taken on, this will repeat. And so we need to get to that issue, and the military driving it.
Thank you so much. Card, you know, we could just do a whole nother webinar on so many of these things, and we've had some fantastic questions come in. I'm sorry that we haven't had time to answer every single question. I'm sure that CND would love to invite you all to do another webinar, and we can carry on this critical conversation, because there's so many places we can go with it. So I just want to thank you all very much for taking part this evening, and I'll see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.